Welcome, friend, to a journey through the quiet darkness of early American nights. Tonight we drift backward through time to an era when rest itself was a fragile negotiation, with cold, with silence, and with the endless wilderness pressing against fragile wooden walls. Imagine yourself there in the depths of winter when the world contracted to the glow of dying embers and the rhythm of your own breath. This is not a story of grand battles or sweeping change, but of something far more intimate, the nightly struggle for warmth, for sleep, for the simple mercy of rest. Before we step into this quiet passage through winter's hold on early frontier life, I'd like to ask a small favor of you. If you find comfort in these stories, gently tap the like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History, so these late-night historical journeys can continue to find you when the world grows still. Leave a comment below. Where are you listening from and what time wraps around you now? Some of you rest in the deep hours of night, others greet the early dawn, and some drift somewhere between waking and dreaming. Now, if you can, dim the lights around you, perhaps turn on a soft fan for that gentle background hum, and settle yourself comfortably. Let's begin our slow descent into the frozen nights of those who came before us. As the wind howls outside your fragile cabin walls, time itself seems to shiver. You'll feel the chill of wooden floors, the hush of candlelight, and the strange beauty of life lived at the edge of survival. You lie awake beneath a thin quilt, the cabin breathing around you like a wooden lung. The darkness is complete, absolute, broken only by the faintest glow of embers that have nearly surrendered to the night. Outside, the wind moves through the pines with a sound like distant water. Inside, the cold creeps upward from the packed earth floor, searching for the warmth of your body with patient, inevitable hunger. This is not the gentle cold of a winter evening by a controlled thermostat. This is the cold that makes your joints ache before you've even moved, that turns your breath to visible mist in the blackness above your face. The cabin walls around you are pine logs, rough-hewn and fitted with whatever care exhaustion would allow. Between each log, moss and clay have been pressed into gaps mixed with dried grass, and sometimes horsehair when it could be spared. But the chinking never holds perfectly. The logs themselves shrink and swell with the seasons, opening new passages for the wind to enter. You can feel these drafts now, thin rivers of icy air that find the back of your neck, the space between blanket and skin. They move across the room like invisible fingers, reminding you that shelter is always partial, always negotiated. The roof above you is bark and wooden shingles, laid in overlapping rows that seemed adequate in autumn. Now, with ice forming along every surface, you know exactly where the leaks will appear when the thaw comes. For now at least, the cold keeps the moisture frozen. Small mercies become the currency of frontier nights. Beneath you, the bed is not what that word suggests to the modern mind. It is a wooden frame, if you were fortunate enough to have time to build one, filled with a tick, a large sack of rough cloth stuffed with straw, dried leaves, or corn husks. The straw crackles when you shift your weight, a sound that seems impossibly loud in the winter silence. It compresses beneath you unevenly, creating valleys and ridges that your body must accommodate rather than the other way around. If your family arrived in spring or summer, you might have had time to gather softer materials. Cattail down, when available, provided better insulation, though it clumped and shifted and needed regular restuffing. Most families made do with whatever the land immediately provided. The deer you shot for winter meat gave you hide and fat, but the hide was too valuable for a bed. It became clothing, hinges, rope, 1,000 more urgent things. So you sleep on straw covered by whatever layers you've assembled. A wool blanket, perhaps, if you carried one from the east, or traded for it at terrible cost. More likely, you have a quilt pieced together from worn clothing, filled with cotton if you're in the south, or wool batting if you came from colder regions. Every scrap has a history. This piece from a dress your mother wore, that piece from your father's work shirt. The quilt is heavy, necessary, but never quite enough. You've learned to sleep in your day clothes, adding your coat when the temperature drops further. Your children sleep pressed against you and your wife, 3 or 4 bodies arranged like cordwood in the only bed the cabin contains. The baby sleeps between you and your wife, the safest position, where your combined warmth creates a small pocket of survivable temperature. The older children sleep on the outside edges, and you've noticed how they've learned to curl inward, to make themselves small, to burrow into whatever warmth the family generates collectively. No one sleeps stretched out. Comfort is measured in heat retention, not physical ease. Body heat becomes a shared resource, carefully managed. On the coldest nights, even the dog sleeps at the foot of the bed, adding its warmth to the collective effort. You've heard of families who kept piglets in the cabin during winter, their animal heat a calculation of survival. Some nights you understand why. The fire in the hearth has burned down to coals, a deliberate choice made before sleep. A roaring fire consumes wood too quickly, and wood represents hours of labor, felling, hauling, splitting, stacking. The mathematics of survival are simple and brutal. Every log burning now is one less for tomorrow. You've learned to let the fire diminish to a glow, just enough to prevent complete freezing, just enough to allow for rekindling before dawn. But this means the temperature inside the cabin drops steadily through the night. By the hours before dawn, ice sometimes forms on the water bucket near the door. You've woken to find frost on the inside of the walls, delicate crystals growing where your breath met freezing wood. Beauty and discomfort are not opposites here. They coexist in every moment. The rhythm of your days has trained you into a kind of exhausted readiness for sleep. From first light until dark, there is no pause, wood to cut, water to haul, animals to tend, endless maintenance of the fragile systems keeping you alive. Your hands are rough, crossed with small cuts that never quite heal in the cold. Your back carries a permanent ache from bending to hearth and field and woodpile. So sleep should come easily, a body shutting down from pure exhaustion. And sometimes it does, a falling into darkness so complete it feels like drowning in silence. But other nights, like this one, sleep is elusive. Your mind won't quiet, cycling through tomorrow's necessities, calculating wood supplies, worrying about the livestock in their crude shelter outside. The night sounds don't help. The wilderness is never truly silent. Silence itself would be alarming, a sign that predators move nearby. Instead, you hear the wind's constant conversation with the trees. Pine boughs creak and sway, a rhythmic groaning that becomes almost musical if you let yourself listen without fear. Farther out, an owl calls, its voice carrying across the frozen distances. You've learned to identify which owl by its call, the great horned with its deep hooting, the barn owl's eerie shriek. Sometimes you hear wolves, their howls rising and falling in patterns that seem to carry meaning. The sound makes your children stir in their sleep, pressing closer. The wolves rarely come near the cabin, but their presence is a reminder of the thin boundary between your small circle of warmth and the vast indifference beyond. You keep the rifle near the bed, powder and shot within reach, though the cold makes you worry about misfire. Inside the cabin, smaller sounds punctuate the night. Mice move in the walls, a skittering that you've learned to ignore because there's nothing to be done about it. They've found ways into your winter stores despite your efforts, and you'll discover their damage in the morning. Another problem for another time. Sleep is the present necessity. The logs themselves speak constantly. As the temperature drops, the wood contracts, producing sharp cracks that sound alarmingly like breaking. The first winter, these sounds terrified you, sending you bolt upright in the darkness, certain the cabin was collapsing. Now you know the difference between the voice of freezing wood and actual structural failure. Now you merely note each crack, each groan, filing the information away. The northeast corner sounds different lately. You'll need to check the chinking there when the weather breaks. Your wife shifts beside you, and you feel her wakefulness even though she doesn't speak. She's listening too to the baby's breathing, to the wind, to all the small sounds that might mean danger. You've both learned to sleep lightly, to surface from dreams at any irregularity. Deep sleep is a luxury you can't afford, not with children to protect, not with fire to maintain. In the old country, in the settlements back east, you remember sleeping differently. Houses had multiple rooms, glass windows, plaster walls that held the heat. Your parents' house had a bedroom separate from the kitchen, privacy that now seems impossibly sophisticated. You slept under goose down, woke to fires already lit by servants or older siblings. That life feels distant now, almost imaginary. Sometimes you wonder if you've invented those memories, if comfort was ever really so simple. Here, privacy doesn't exist. Every sound your body makes is heard by everyone. Every dream muttered aloud becomes family knowledge. Your children have never known anything else. They sleep easily in this collective arrangement. But you and your wife sometimes exchange glances that acknowledge what's been lost. The night stretches on, measured in the slow dimming of the coals. You know from experience that the coldest hours come just before dawn, when the fire is at its lowest and the winter night reaches its deepest point. That's when you'll wake yourself, or your wife will wake, to add wood to the fire. One of you will rise into the shocking cold, feet on frozen floor, and coax the embers back to flame. It's a task you alternate without discussion, a shared burden. Whoever wakes first, whoever feels the cold most urgently, makes the sacrifice. For now you try to rest, try to let the exhaustion pull you down. You focus on your breathing, on the small warmth where your children press against you. Outside, snow has begun to fall, though you can't see it in the darkness. You can hear it, though, the way it changes the quality of the silence, softening the wind's edge. Snow is a mixed blessing. It will add weight to the roof, require shoveling in the morning, make travel to the woodpile more difficult, but it also insulates, filling the gaps around the cabin with natural chinking. By morning, a drift will have formed against the north wall, and the temperature inside will have stabilized slightly. You think about the cabin itself, how quickly it had to be built. You arrived in late summer, which gave you perhaps 2 months before the serious cold began. Choosing the site meant finding level ground near water, with enough cleared space for safety, but close enough to timber for building. Every decision was a compromise between ideal and possible. You cut the pines yourself, your hands blistering even through gloves. Each log had to be limbed, dragged onto the site, notched at the ends to fit together. The work was brutal, endless. Your neighbors helped. This was understood, expected, because they knew you'd return the favor when they needed it. Together you raised the walls in a day, the logs stacked and fitted. The roof took longer, required more skill. Your neighbor, who'd built 3 cabins before this, showed you how to split shingles, how to overlap them properly. But there wasn't time for refinement, for the slow work of making things truly weather-tight. Winter was coming. Speed mattered more than quality. So you live now in this rough shelter, adequate for survival, but barely comfortable. You've promised yourself that next summer you'll think the gaps better, build proper shutters for the window openings, perhaps add a sleeping loft for the children. Next summer. That phrase sustains you through these frozen nights, the promise that conditions will improve, that you're building towards something better. Your children will grow up here, probably, unless you move again. The frontier keeps shifting westward, and there's always the temptation of better land, more opportunity. But for now, this is home. These rough walls, this frozen floor, this straw bed where you sleep, pressed together. This is what you've built against the wilderness. You think of your own childhood, sleeping in a real bed in a real house. How spoiled you were without knowing it. How you took for granted the simple miracle of warmth. Your children will have no such memories. This hardship is their normal, their baseline. You wonder if that's better or worse. The baby makes a small sound, not quite crying, and your wife shifts to nurse. Even this has to be calculated, exposing skin to cold air, finding a position that doesn't let the heat escape from under the blankets. You hear her soft murmuring, wordless comfort. The baby settles, suckles, quiets. These small victories matter enormously. An older child stirs, mutters something unintelligible. You reach out and pat their shoulder, a reassurance that you're there. Everything's safe. They settle again without fully waking. This is the dance of frontier family sleep. Constant small adjustments, constant monitoring. No one sleeps deeply for long. You're always half listening, half ready to respond. You remember stories from back east, tales of Indian raids, of families murdered in their beds. Those stories took on different weight once you moved here. You know your native neighbors are not the monsters of those tales. You've traded with them, learned from them, even shared meals. But tension exists, misunderstandings happen, and violence is always a possibility. So the rifle stays near the bed. So you wake at every unusual sound. So sleep itself becomes a kind of vigilance. The wind picks up outside and you hear something metal rattling, probably the bucket you left by the well. Tomorrow you'll need to bring all loose items inside or lash them down. The wind finds a new gap in the chinking, a thin whistle that wasn't there before. Another task for tomorrow, find where the gap opened, press in new clay and moss. The list of maintenance never ends. The cabin is not a finished thing but a constant project, always needing repair, adjustment, protection against entropy. You close your eyes again, willing sleep to come. You know you'll wake in a few hours to tend the fire, and then again before dawn. Rest must be taken in small portions, carefully rationed. Your wife's breathing has deepened slightly. She's managed to slip into real sleep. You're glad for that. She works as hard as you do, maybe harder, with fewer chances to pause. The baby's weight on her chest, the older children flanking you both. This arrangement is practicality, not sentiment. But sometimes, in the dark, you feel something like contentment. You're alive, your family is alive, you have shelter, however crude. You have enough food to last the winter, if you're careful. These are not small things, these are everything. Outside, a branch breaks under the weight of snow, the crack carrying clearly through the still air. You note it, file it away, no immediate threat, and let yourself drift. The cold is always there, a constant pressure. But you've learned to exist within it, to find the small warmth of bodies pressed together, of breath and blood, and the stubborn persistence of life. This is how settlers sleep, lightly, collectively, always half ready for whatever comes. Rest is not the absence of awareness, but a kind of practiced endurance. You think of the cabin as a living thing, expanding and contracting with temperature, breathing with the wind. You are inside it, and it is inside you, this rough shelter, that barely holds back the wilderness. Dawn is still hours away. The night will grow colder still before the first grey light appears. But you're here, wrapped in whatever warmth can be gathered, surviving another night through nothing more than determination and the heat of human bodies refusing to surrender. Sleep comes finally, fitfully. You dream of spring, of days warm enough to work without layers of clothing. You dream of your children playing outside in sunlight. Then you wake to tend the fire, and the dream dissolves. The cold rushes in as you leave the bed, shocking and immediate. Your feet hit the floor and you gasp at the temperature. You move quickly to the hearth, add wood to the coals, blow gently until flame catches. The fire grows, reluctant at first, then more eager. Heat begins to push back the cold, a gradual reclaiming of the space. You warm your hands at the new flames, allowing yourself this small pause before returning to bed. Your wife murmurs a thank you, barely awake. You slip back under the blankets, and the warmth you left behind has mostly held. The children haven't stirred. They sleep the deep sleep of the young, trusting completely in their parents' vigilance. You arrange yourself carefully, finding the position that disturbs everyone least. The straw crackles beneath you, settling into new configurations. This time, sleep comes more easily. The fire will hold for another few hours. The worst of the night's cold has passed. You drift, and the cabin breathes around you, and somewhere outside the wolves sing to the indifferent stars. This is the rhythm of settler nights, survival measured in hours, warmth gathered in small portions, rest stolen from the edges of exhaustion. And tomorrow, it will begin again. The gathering of wood, the tending of fire, the constant negotiation with cold and wilderness, and the demands of simply staying alive. But for now, for these remaining hours of darkness, you sleep. Elsewhere in the wilderness, in countless cabins scattered across the frontier, other families endure these same frozen nights. But let us turn our attention now to one woman whose life embodied the particular endurance required of frontier wives and mothers. Rebecca Boone was born in 1739 in the Yadkin Valley of North Carolina, the daughter of a farmer who had himself moved westward seeking better land. She grew to young womanhood in the borderlands between settlement and wilderness, a place where English and German settlers pressed against Cherokee territory. In 1756, at 17, she married Daniel Boone, a young hunter and woodsman already developing the restless wanderlust that would define both their lives. She could not have known that this marriage would mean a lifetime of waiting, of raising children in isolation, of sleeping in crude shelters, while her husband explored ever farther into unmapped territories. Their first years together followed the pattern of frontier farming families. Daniel hunted and trapped. Rebecca kept the household, bore children in quick succession, tended crops and livestock. But Daniel could never settle. The pull of unexplored country drew him away for months at a time, leaving Rebecca to manage alone with growing responsibilities. In 1769, Daniel departed for a 2-year exploration of Kentucky, a land he'd heard described by traders. He returned with stories of rich soil and abundant game, of a paradise waiting to be settled. Rebecca listened to these tales knowing what they meant. Another move, another beginning, another cabin to build in even more remote territory. She was 34 years old, mother to 6 children, when they made the decision to leave North Carolina forever. The first attempt to reach Kentucky ended in tragedy and terror. In 1773, the Boone family and several other families began the journey through the Cumberland Gap. Daniel's eldest son, James, 16 years old, was killed by Indians along with several others in the party. The families retreated back to North Carolina, the dream of Kentucky stained with blood and grief. Rebecca held her family together through this devastation. She had known James since his first breath, had raised him through childhood, had taught him what she could of reading and faith and endurance. Now she buried him in the borderlands and tried to make sense of a world where children could be killed simply for moving westward. The grief lived in her bones, never fully healing, a permanent ache beneath all other concerns. But 2 years later, they tried again. In 1775, the Boone family joined a group establishing Boonesboro in Kentucky, one of the first permanent settlements in that territory. This time, there was no turning back. Rebecca found herself in the deep wilderness, surrounded by danger, living in a fort that was barely more than a collection of cabins enclosed by a wooden palisade. The sleeping arrangements at Boonesborough were even more primitive than a solitary cabin. Multiple families shared the small enclosed space, privacy impossible, tensions constant. Rebecca slept with her children in a corner of the fort, Daniel often absent on hunting trips or diplomatic missions to Indian villages. She learned to sleep through the sounds of other families, through the constant noise of communal living. Winter in Kentucky brought a cold different from North Carolina, a wet cold that penetrated clothing and walls, that created mud everywhere, that made every task twice as difficult. The fort's cabins were hastily built, the chinking poor, the roofs inadequate. Rebecca spent those winters in a state of constant low-level misery, cold, damp, hungry more often than not, responsible for keeping her children alive while Daniel pursued his larger ambitions. She told herself this was temporary, that better conditions lay just ahead. But frontier life never improved, it only changed location. When they finally built a proper cabin outside the fort, the isolation brought its own terrors. She was miles from any neighbor, responsible for defending the homestead when Daniel was away. She learned to load and fire a rifle, to recognize the sounds that meant danger, to sleep with one ear always listening. Her days began before light and ended long after dark. Water had to be hauled from the spring, a journey she made multiple times daily, always watching the tree line for movement. Wood had to be gathered constantly, an endless task that blistered her hands even through gloves. The fire could never be allowed to die completely, not in winter, not when rekindling might mean the difference between survival and freezing. Cooking was done in the fireplace, all meals prepared by squatting or kneeling before the flames. Her face grew weathered from constant heat on one side, constant drafts on the other. She spun thread from flax and wool, wove fabric on a simple loom, sewed all the family's clothing by hand. When something wore out, it was patched until no original fabric remained, then cut up for quilts or cleaning rags. Her children grew and multiplied despite the hardships. She bore 10 children in total, each pregnancy and birth managed with whatever help could be found, sometimes a neighbor woman, sometimes Daniel, often no one but herself. She delivered some of her babies alone, cutting the cord with her own hands, cleaning the infant, while her other children waited anxiously in another corner of the cabin. This was not considered extraordinary, this was simply what frontier women did. The infant mortality she witnessed shaped her understanding of motherhood. 3 of her children died young, their small bodies buried in frontier soil without markers or ceremony beyond her own prayers. She learned not to love too hard in those early months, to hold something back until a child proved strong enough to survive. But this protection never really worked. Each loss carved away another piece of her, grief layered upon grief. The nights were when the fear came strongest. Daniel gone for weeks or months, no word of whether he lived or died, and Rebecca alone with the children in the darkness. She lay awake, listening to sounds outside, trying to distinguish between animal and human, between natural forest noise and the careful approach of danger. Her rifle rested within reach. Her children's breathing was the only reassurance she had. Sometimes Indians did come, not always hostile, sometimes merely curious or seeking trade. But Rebecca could never know which encounter might turn violent, so she treated all with cautious wariness. During the Revolution, the danger intensified. Kentucky became contested ground, British allied Indians raiding settlements, settlers retaliating, violence spiraling in all directions. In 1776, Rebecca's daughter Jemima was captured along with 2 other girls while canoeing on the river near Boonesborough. Daniel led the rescue party that recovered them after 2 days, but the terror of those days lived permanently in Rebecca's heart. She had already lost one son to frontier violence. Now her daughter had been taken, and though returned safely, the message was clear. No one was safe. No moment could be taken for granted. After that incident, Rebecca insisted the family move back to North Carolina. Daniel agreed, and for a brief time they lived in relative civilization again, close to Rebecca's family. But Daniel's debts and land disputes followed them, and the pull of Kentucky remained. Within a year they returned to the frontier, and Rebecca resigned herself to the life she'd tried to escape. The pattern repeated through the following decades, building a cabin, establishing a farm, losing it to Indian raids or legal complications, moving again. Rebecca packed and unpacked their belongings so many times the routine became automatic. Each new cabin meant the same work: chinking gaps, improving the chimney, establishing sleeping arrangements, creating some small sense of home from raw materials and exhaustion. She became expert at making something livable from almost nothing. Her sleep grew ever lighter through these years. She developed the ability to wake fully alert at the smallest wrong sound, to move from deep sleep to armed readiness in seconds. This hypervigilance became part of her body, a permanent rewiring of how rest worked. Even in old age, when the dangers had passed, she would wake at night listening for threats that no longer existed. Daniel's wanderlust never faded. In their old age, when most couples settled into quiet domesticity, he convinced Rebecca to move again, this time to Missouri, then Spanish territory where land was cheap and plentiful. She was 60 years old, exhausted by decades of frontier life, but she packed once more. They built another cabin, this one near present-day Marthasville, Missouri. The work was the same, always the same: fire to maintain, water to haul, children, and now grandchildren to feed. But Rebecca's body had memorized these motions. She moved through them with a kind of unconscious grace born of endless repetition. She slept in this final cabin, much as she'd slept in all the others, lightly, ready, never fully surrendering to rest. The habits of frontier survival had become permanent, carved into her nervous system. Daniel died in 1820, leaving Rebecca a widow at 81. She survived him by several years, living with family, finally released from the burden of constant vigilance. But even then, those who knew her noted how she'd wake at night, how she'd listen to sounds outside with an intensity that spoke of old fears never quite erased. The frontier had marked her permanently, had shaped the very pattern of her sleep. Rebecca Boone died in 1813, having outlived all but one of her children, having survived dangers that would have broken a less resilient spirit. She was buried in Missouri, far from where she'd been born, in soil she'd helped tame through pure endurance. Her grave marker, placed years later, bore simple facts: her name, her dates, her role as wife and mother. It said nothing of the thousands of nights she'd spent half awake, listening for danger. It said nothing of the fires she'd tended through darkness, the children she'd comforted while cold seeped through cabin walls. It said nothing of the sheer physical and emotional labor required to survive as a frontier woman. But Rebecca's life speaks across the centuries with a quiet power. She was not unique. Thousands of women endured similar hardships, their names unrecorded, their stories lost. Yet her particular story, preserved because of Daniel's fame, reminds us that frontier settlement was not only a masculine adventure of exploration and conquest, it was also a feminine endurance of domestic survival, of keeping families alive through sheer determination. The cabins where these women slept were not homes in any comfortable sense. They were survival shelters, barely adequate, constantly demanding maintenance and attention. Sleep in these cabins was not rest, but a kind of vigilant endurance. It was lying awake, wondering if your husband would return, if your children would survive the winter, if the next sound would bring danger or merely another cold dawn. Rebecca learned to find small comforts where she could: a child's healthy laughter, a successful harvest, a morning without immediate crisis. These moments were enough, had to be enough. In the cold heart of the wilderness, comfort was not found in the cabin itself, but in the quiet endurance of those who refused to give up. Rebecca Boone embodied this endurance, night after difficult night, year after year. Her story is not one of triumph, but of survival, not of conquest, but of persistence. And perhaps that is the more valuable story, the one that shows how ordinary people endured extraordinary hardship through nothing more than determination and love. As we drift now from Rebecca's particular story back into the broader patterns of frontier life, her presence lingers. Every unnamed woman who slept lightly in a frontier cabin carries something of her spirit: the refusal to surrender, the commitment to survival, the love that made endurance possible. The darkness of a frontier cabin was not empty. It was filled with beliefs, superstitions, and rituals that shaped how settlers understood the vulnerable hours of night. Sleep was not simply a biological necessity, but a liminal state where the boundary between waking world and the spiritual realm grew thin and permeable. Settlers brought with them from Europe a complex folklore of night, dreams, and the dangers that prowled after darkness fell. These old-world beliefs, mixed with Native American traditions and the particular anxieties of frontier life, to create a unique culture of sleep. The traditions carried across the Atlantic were ancient, rooted in medieval understandings of the cosmos and humanity's place within it. Night was not merely the absence of day, but a different realm entirely, governed by different laws and inhabited by different forces. European peasants had long believed that souls wandered during sleep, venturing into spiritual territories while the body lay vulnerable. This belief crossed the ocean intact, finding new expression in the wilderness where physical dangers mirrored the spiritual ones families had always feared. The Atlantic crossing itself did not diminish these convictions, but rather intensified them in the strange new landscape. Settlers found themselves in a land they did not understand, surrounded by unfamiliar sounds and presences that seemed to confirm their ancestral fears. The mixture of cultures on the frontier created something neither purely European nor purely Native American. It was a hybrid born of necessity, where survival mattered more than maintaining rigid cultural boundaries in the intimate privacy of nighttime rituals. Dreams held enormous significance for frontier families, serving as a language through which the universe communicated warnings and promises. A dream of fire meant danger approaching, either literal fire or metaphorical destruction of the family's fortunes. A dream of clear water signified good health and prosperity ahead, the flowing purity representing life force unobstructed. A dream of muddy water meant illness or trouble brewing in the family, the clouded current suggesting contamination or confusion entering their lives. To dream of a snake meant betrayal by someone trusted, the serpent's ancient association with deception carrying forward into the American wilderness. Dreaming of losing teeth foretold the death of a family member within the year, the permanent loss symbolizing an irreversible absence about to occur. These interpretations were passed down through generations, refined through countless retellings until they became gospel truth. The consistency of interpretation across families and regions suggests a shared symbolic language that transcended individual imagination. A dream of a white horse was universally positive, suggesting good fortune and divine favor descending upon the household. A black dog in dreams meant depression or melancholy would visit the household soon, its dark form representing the shadow that would fall across daily life. Settlers kept careful track of their dreams, sometimes recording them in journals or discussing them at breakfast, with the seriousness others reserved for business matters. The interpretation of dreams was considered a practical skill, like reading weather signs or tracking animals, essential to survival and prosperity. Women often served as the primary dream interpreters within families, their insights sought and valued by husbands who might publicly dismiss such concerns. A mother's interpretation of a child's nightmare carried weight, shaping how the family understood and responded to potential dangers lurking in their immediate future. The seasonal nature of dreams was also noted and discussed with careful attention to patterns that emerged over years of observation. Dreams in winter were thought to be more prophetic than summer dreams, perhaps because the long, dark nights made the boundary between worlds especially permeable. Dreams occurring on specific dates held special significance. Dreams on Christmas Eve, Midsummer Night, or All Hallows Eve were believed to carry messages that should not be ignored. These were nights when the ordinary laws of nature loosened, allowing glimpses into what was hidden from mortal sight during more mundane times. Many frontier women claimed prophetic dreams, visions of future events that came to pass with unsettling accuracy that could not be dismissed as mere coincidence. These dreams often came during pregnancy or times of extreme stress, when the boundary between waking and sleeping grew especially fragile and the veil between worlds wore thin. Pregnant women were considered particularly open to spiritual messages, their condition making them conduits between the unborn and the living world. Their dreams about the child they carried were scrutinized for clues about the baby's future character and fate, each symbol analyzed for its meaning. Rebecca Boone herself reported a dream warning her of danger days before an Indian attack, a vision that allowed her family to prepare and ultimately survive. Others dreamed of distant relatives dying at the very hour of their death, news that would be confirmed weeks later when word finally reached the frontier through travelers or postal riders. The phenomenon of simultaneous death dreams was common enough that it became accepted as fact rather than coincidence, discussed openly without the skepticism such claims would receive in later, more scientific times. A woman in Kentucky might wake crying from a dream of her mother's death in Virginia, only to receive confirmation weeks later that her mother had indeed died at that exact hour. Whether these dreams represented true prophecy, coincidence, or the mind's ability to process subtle warnings unconsciously, settlers treated them as real communications from beyond ordinary perception. To ignore a vivid dream was considered foolish and potentially dangerous, an arrogant dismissal of knowledge offered by forces greater than human understanding. Men sometimes dismissed these beliefs publicly, performing skepticism as part of their rational masculinity and their role as practical heads of household. But privately, in the darkness of their cabins, they too paid attention to dreams and heeded warnings their wives or mothers reported, unwilling to risk their families on philosophical consistency. The objects settlers placed near their beds reflected these beliefs in tangible, material ways that archaeological evidence continues to confirm. Many kept a Bible under their pillow or on a small shelf within reach, the holy book serving as both spiritual comfort and protective talisman against the forces of darkness. The specific placement mattered. The Bible should not touch the floor, as this showed disrespect and weakened its protective power by allowing it to be trampled symbolically. Some families kept multiple Bibles in different rooms, ensuring no space was left unguarded against spiritual threats that might enter through any opening. Small items of personal significance were tucked into the straw ticks: a child's first baby tooth, a lock of hair from a deceased loved one, a smooth stone from the old country. These objects were thought to provide protection or carry blessings into sleep, their personal history imbuing them with power beyond their material nature. A button from a father's wedding suit might be sewn into a child's mattress to ensure the child inherited the father's strength and virtue, the physical connection creating a spiritual transmission. A piece of the mother's wedding dress carried blessings of fertility and protection over daughters, the fabric that had witnessed sacred vows now extending those promises to the next generation. Women sometimes sewed protective symbols into quilts, patterns that looked decorative but carried deeper meaning known to those who understood the old ways. Certain geometric designs were believed to ward off nightmares or evil influences, their mathematical precision creating barriers that chaos could not penetrate. The log cabin pattern, with its interlocking squares, was thought to create a maze that confused evil spirits trying to reach the sleeper. The bear's paw pattern invoked the protective strength of that powerful animal, calling upon the bear's fierce maternal instincts to guard vulnerable sleepers. Star patterns called down celestial protection, each point representing a different form of divine favor radiating from heaven to earth. The Tree of Life pattern ensured continued health and vitality for those who slept beneath it, the ancient symbol of eternal renewal working its magic through the night. Colors in quilts also mattered. Red thread was protective, its association with blood and life force creating barriers against death and harm. Blue promoted peaceful sleep, its connection to sky and heaven inviting calm and divine presence into the sleeping space. White invited purity and divine presence, creating an atmosphere conducive to angelic protection and moral clarity. These color choices were deliberate, never random, each stitch carrying intention and prayer woven directly into the fabric that would embrace sleepers through vulnerable hours. The placement of the bed itself mattered according to principles both spiritual and practical that had been tested across generations. Many settlers insisted on orienting the bed so children's heads pointed east toward Jerusalem, inviting divine favor and protection through the night. This eastern orientation connected sleepers to the Holy Land, creating a spiritual alignment that would carry them safely through darkness by linking them to sacred geography. It was believed that prayers spoken while facing east were more likely to be heard and answered, the directional component amplifying spiritual communication. Some refused to sleep with their feet pointing toward the door, believing this position invited death, the orientation used for carrying out a corpse. Others considered it bad luck to move a bed on Friday or to change its position during a waning moon, when all things were thought to be in decline. The bed's legs should stand firmly on the floor, never on a carpet or rug, to maintain direct connection with the earth and the grounding force it provided. Beds should not be placed where moonlight would fall directly on the sleeper's face, as this could cause madness or restless sleep, the moon's influence being both powerful and unpredictable. Windows posed a particular problem. They let in necessary air but also potential spiritual threats that might slip through glass as easily as light. Beds were positioned to avoid being in direct line with a window, preventing anything from entering through the glass and reaching the sleeper directly without passing through protective barriers. These beliefs seem quaint now, but they provided a sense of control in situations where actual control was minimal. By following certain rules, settlers felt they were actively protecting their families rather than merely enduring dangers passively, transforming themselves from victims into guardians. The elaborate system of do's and don'ts created structure in chaos, transforming random chance into manageable ritual that could be passed down and perfected. If disaster struck despite following all the rules, at least the family could feel they had done everything possible, their conscience clear even in grief. The practice of protective prayer before sleep was nearly universal, cutting across different Christian denominations from strict Calvinist to relaxed frontier Methodist. Families gathered before bed for scripture reading and prayer, the ritual marking the transition from waking to sleeping with clear intentionality. This gathering was mandatory, not optional. Children who resisted were compelled to participate, as their spiritual safety depended on it, and parental authority would not be challenged in matters of eternal consequence. The family circle, united in prayer, created a protective barrier against the night's dangers, the combined faith more powerful than any individual supplication. Children were taught specific bedtime prayers, simple verses that asked God's protection through the dangerous hours of night when evil forces roamed most freely. Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. This familiar prayer originated in this era, emerging from the real fear that one might not wake in the morning. The prayer's final line, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take," was not morbid to frontier families, but simply realistic. Death could come at any time, from disease, accident, or violence, and spiritual preparation was considered essential for adults and children alike. Children learned to recite these prayers perfectly, word for word without variation, the exactness being part of the protective power. Any mistake required starting over, as an imperfect prayer might not provide complete protection, leaving gaps through which harm could enter. Older children were taught longer prayers, more elaborate supplications that demonstrated their growing spiritual maturity and ability to take responsibility for their own souls. By adolescence, young people were expected to pray silently on their own, having internalized the protective rituals and made them personal rather than merely obedient. Parents listened to ensure children prayed with proper reverence, not rushing through the words mechanically without engaging their hearts and minds. A prayer spoken without true feeling was worse than no prayer at all, potentially insulting divine powers rather than invoking their protection, turning what should be a shield into a provocation. After prayers, the fire had to be properly managed, not extinguished completely, which would mean a cold dawn and difficult rekindling, but carefully banked so coals would hold through the night. The process of banking a fire was itself ritualized, passed from mother to daughter, as essential knowledge that could mean the difference between comfort and misery, even survival and death in extreme cold. First, the remaining wood was arranged to burn slowly, creating a bed of coals that would maintain heat without consuming fuel too quickly. Then ashes were carefully pulled over the coals, not smothering them but insulating them, allowing slow combustion that would last for hours without attention. The technique required practice and attention. Too many ashes and the fire died completely, forcing a difficult rekindling from scratch in the cold morning darkness. Too few, and it burned too hot and fast, consuming the night's fuel supply before dawn and potentially creating danger of sparks escaping the hearth. Experienced women could judge by feel and sight exactly how much ash to use for different weather conditions, adjusting their technique as naturally as they adjusted recipes for available ingredients. On the coldest nights, a slightly hotter fire was banked, ensuring morning warmth, but requiring more frequent night checking to prevent it burning through the fuel supply. During milder weather, the fire could be banked more heavily, reducing the need for nighttime tending and allowing deeper, less interrupted sleep. Some families spoke a small blessing over the banked fire, thanking it for warmth provided and asking it to last until morning, treating the flame almost as a family member. Fire was considered almost alive, an entity that required respect and care, capable of blessing with warmth or cursing with destruction. The blessing also requested that the fire not spread, that it remain contained and safe throughout the night when no one watched vigilantly. The extinguishing of candles or Betty lamps followed, these small lights being carefully snuffed to preserve what remained for future use. These sources of illumination were expensive, candles made from rendered animal fat or precious beeswax, Betty lamps burning bear grease or other rendered fats that took considerable effort to produce. Light was rationed carefully. One candle might have to last a week or more, making each lighting a considered decision. So the final light was snuffed with ceremony, the smoke curling upward as darkness closed in completely, marking the formal beginning of night's reign. The smell of extinguished candle smoke became associated with bedtime, a scent that signaled the transition to sleep as powerfully as any verbal announcement. Even today, that particular smell can evoke deep, almost primal responses in those who encounter it, reaching backward through generations to ancestral memory. In this total darkness, a darkness modern people rarely experience, unmarked by streetlights or electronic glows, the cabin became a different place. Sounds seemed louder, distances unclear, the imagination free to populate shadows with fears that daylight would have dismissed as absurd. The darkness was so complete that people literally could not see their hands in front of their faces, an absence of light so absolute it felt like a presence in itself. This absolute blackness transformed familiar spaces into mysterious territories where every creak and rustle demanded interpretation, where the known became unknown simply through the absence of visual confirmation. Children who had been brave in daylight became frightened in this dark, their earlier bravado evaporating the moment the last flame was extinguished. Parents learned to speak calmly, to provide reassurance without dismissing fears, to help small minds settle into sleep despite the pressing dark that seemed to have weight and texture. Fathers might tell stories in the darkness, their voices creating islands of safety in the sea of night, the familiar sound anchoring children to reality. These stories were carefully chosen, amusing or adventurous, but never frightening, designed to distract rather than alarm, to populate the darkness with harmless images rather than monsters. Mothers might sing softly, lullabies brought from the old country or learned from neighbors, melodies that had soothed children for generations. The human voice in darkness was profoundly comforting, a reminder that one was not alone in the vast night, that family remained close even when invisible. Some families left a tiny flame burning all night, a small Betty lamp with the wick turned very low, creating just enough light to push back the worst of the darkness. This was considered acceptable despite the expense, a necessary concession to children's fears and practical need for emergency light if someone took ill or danger threatened. The small flame also served practical purposes. If someone needed to move in the night, they could see enough to avoid obstacles and accidents without the disorientation of complete darkness. A dim light allowed parents to check on children without fully waking or creating disturbance, maintaining the household's rest while ensuring safety. The interaction between settlers and their Native American neighbors included the exchange of sleep-related knowledge, though such exchanges were rarely acknowledged publicly, given the tensions and violence that often characterized frontier relations. Indigenous peoples had developed sophisticated understandings of how to sleep comfortably in harsh conditions, knowledge born of thousands of years of experience in the very environment settlers now struggled to master. This knowledge transfer often happened through intermediaries, traders, interpreters, or captives who had lived with indigenous peoples and learned their ways before returning to settler society. Some settlers married into Native American families, gaining direct access to accumulated wisdom that would otherwise have remained hidden behind cultural boundaries. Settlers learned about sleeping platforms raised off the ground, which avoided the worst of the floor's cold and the dampness that could seep through earthen surfaces. They learned about bark mats woven in patterns that trapped air, providing insulation superior to simple straw through principles of layering and air pocket creation. The construction of these platforms was surprisingly sophisticated, using flexible wood that gave slightly underweight, providing support without the hardness of a solid floor. The slight elevation allowed air circulation underneath, preventing the dampness that could seep up from earthen floors and create conditions for illness and discomfort. They learned about the strategic use of animal hides, which animals provided the warmest furs, how to treat and cure hides to remain soft and insulating rather than stiff and uncomfortable. Buffalo robes, when available, were prized above all others for their combination of warmth and weight, each hide representing both enormous effort and incomparable comfort. Bear hides were valued for their thickness and durability, though they were heavier and less flexible than buffalo, requiring different handling and preparation techniques. Deer hides were lighter and more readily available, but provided less warmth, making them suitable for summer sleeping or layering with other materials. The proper curing of hides was an art form in itself, requiring knowledge of tanning agents, scraping techniques, and timing that took years to master. Raw hides were stiff and smelled unpleasant, useless for bedding, but properly tanned and softened hides became supple and nearly odorless, transformed through skill and labor. Some settlers adopted the practice of smoking hides near the sleeping area before winter, believing the smoke carried protective properties and discouraged insects that might infest bedding. Others learned to layer different materials, hide closest to the body, then wool, then another hide, creating air pockets that dramatically improved insulation through the principle of dead air space. The layering principle was crucial. Trapped air, not the materials themselves, provided the primary insulation, a fact that indigenous peoples understood through observation and practice. Understanding this allowed settlers to maximize warmth without excessive weight, crucial when bedding had to be portable for families who moved seasonally or relocated entirely to new homesteads. The dream catcher, that iconic symbol, now commercialized beyond recognition and stripped of its original meaning, originally came from Ojibwe tradition and was sometimes adopted by settlers who lived near Great Lakes tribes. The web design was believed to catch bad dreams while allowing good ones to pass through, the feathers providing a gentle path for beneficial visions to reach the sleeper below. Whether settlers understood the full cultural and spiritual context of these objects is doubtful, but their adoption speaks to the permeability of the frontier, a place where survival sometimes mattered more than cultural purity. Practical wisdom crossed boundaries that politics and prejudice erected, flowing wherever need was greatest and minds were open enough to receive it. Some indigenous peoples shared not just physical techniques, but spiritual ones, songs to sing before sleep, specific prayers or invocations to ensure peaceful rest and protection from malevolent spirits. These spiritual technologies were often adopted quietly, never acknowledged publicly, but preserved in the intimate privacy of bedtime rituals where cultural mixing could occur without social consequence. The influence flowed in both directions, creating a cultural exchange that history has often overlooked in favor of conflict narratives. Native peoples sometimes adopted European textile blankets when they could be obtained through trade, valuing their warmth and portability over traditional materials that required more labor to produce. Both cultures shared the fundamental challenge of surviving cold nights with limited resources, and both developed sophisticated strategies that the other could learn from. The frontier was, in this sense, a place of pragmatic cultural exchange, however fraught the broader relationship between settlers and indigenous peoples remained in political and military spheres. Trade blankets became valuable commodities, their colors and patterns developing specific meanings in indigenous cultures that Europeans rarely understood. A red blanket might indicate one thing, a blue another, the European goods being absorbed and transformed by Native American symbolic systems that gave them new significance. Archaeological evidence from frontier homesteads reveals traces of these nighttime rituals and beliefs, material remnants that speak across centuries to modern researchers. Excavations at 18th century cabin sites have uncovered small caches of objects buried beneath hearthstones, buttons, coins, folded paper with handwritten prayers or Bible verses, each placed with intention and care. These were protective deposits meant to guard the home and its inhabitants from spiritual and physical threats through the power of sacred objects. The hearth, being the literal and symbolic center of the home, was considered the most powerful location for such objects, the fire's transformative power lending strength to the charms. The practice of foundation deposits was ancient, stretching back to European building traditions where objects were ritually placed during construction to bless and protect structures. On the frontier, these traditions continued, adapted to new circumstances and materials, but maintaining their essential purpose of creating safety through ritual. Other artifacts found include the remains of straw mattresses, identifiable by compressed plant matter, and the occasional metal pin or needle used in sewing the tick. The straw shows patterns of wear, revealing how people arranged themselves, usually on their sides, curled inward, minimizing exposed surface area to conserve precious body heat. The forensic analysis of these sleeping positions tells us much about frontier life. People slept conserving heat, protecting vulnerable organs, instinctively assuming defensive postures even in sleep. Modern people, sleeping sprawled in heated rooms, have lost this instinctive huddling, the evolutionary wisdom that guided rest in dangerous conditions. Charred wood samples from these sites, analyzed for growth rings and burn patterns, confirm what written accounts describe, that fires were maintained at low levels through the night, never fully extinguished, but never roaring. The art of fire management was central to frontier survival, as fundamental as any other skill settlers had to master in the wilderness. Wood selection for nighttime burning followed specific patterns. Hardwoods that burned slowly and maintained coals were preferred over fast-burning softwoods that provided brief heat but little lasting warmth. Oak, hickory, and maple were prized for night fires, while pine and cedar were avoided except for kindling due to their quick consumption. Candle stubs and Betty lamp fragments appear frequently in archaeological excavations, often found near where beds would have been placed based on other evidence. These small artifacts speak to the ritual of light and darkness, the careful management of illumination in an age when light itself was a precious commodity not to be wasted. More poignant are the personal items sometimes discovered, a carved wooden toy hidden in wall gaps, suggesting a child's attempt to protect a treasured possession from siblings, or simply to have it close. A woman's hair comb tucked into the space between logs, perhaps placed there during sleep and forgotten, speaks to moments of casual domesticity that suddenly feel intimate across the centuries. These intimate objects create a direct connection across time, bridging the gap between past and present through shared humanity. They were touched by hands like ours, used in moments of routine domesticity, a mother combing her daughter's hair before bed, a child playing one last time before being called to sleep, the ordinary moments that fill lives in any era. The worn smoothness of a wooden toy handle speaks to countless hours of play, countless bedtimes when the child clutched it for comfort against the dark. Small bells sometimes appear in excavations, tiny brass or silver bells that may have been attached to cradles or children's beds to alert parents when a baby stirred. The soft chiming would have been comforting to children and useful to parents, signaling when a child stirred or needed attention without requiring constant vigilance. These bells represent yet another layer of nighttime management, the tools parents used to navigate the darkness while maintaining their own rest. The folklore of night extended beyond individual families to community beliefs shared across the frontier, creating a collective understanding of danger and protection. Certain nights were considered especially dangerous for supernatural activity, the new moon when darkness was most complete, or the equinoxes when day and night balanced in uneasy equilibrium that suggested cosmic instability. On these nights, extra precautions were taken without question or complaint, the heightened vigilance accepted as necessary wisdom. Prayers were longer, protective charms checked and renewed, weapons placed even closer to hand in case spiritual danger manifested in physical form. Whether the actual danger increased on these nights is less relevant than the psychological comfort provided by increased vigilance and the sense of community it created. The ritual acknowledgement of heightened risk allowed people to feel they were confronting danger actively rather than passively hoping for safety, transforming anxiety into action. The folk belief in hag riding was common. the experience we now call sleep paralysis, where one wakes but cannot move, often with a sensation of weight pressing on the chest. Frontier settlers attributed this to witches or malevolent spirits sitting on the sleeper's chest, stealing breath and energy for their own dark purposes. The experience was terrifying, fully conscious but completely immobilized, often accompanied by hallucinations or sense of presence that felt absolutely real in the moment. Modern medicine explains this as a disconnect between consciousness and muscle control during the transition between sleep stages, but frontier people had no such framework for understanding. Remedies against hag riding included placing shoes at specific angles beside the bed, hanging a horseshoe over the door, or keeping a broom within reach. The belief being that supernatural entities would be compelled to count the broom's straws and thus be distracted until dawn broke their power, the obsessive counting keeping them occupied until morning light banished them. The shoe remedy was particularly specific. Shoes should be placed with toes pointing away from the bed, creating a symbolic barrier that spirits could not cross. Some insisted shoes should be crossed, forming a protective X shape that evil could not cross, the intersection representing the cross of Christ repelling darkness. Salt was another common protection, a line of salt across the threshold preventing supernatural entry through its preservative and purifying properties. Salt's preservative properties made it symbolically pure and protective in cultures worldwide, its ability to prevent decay representing power over death itself. Nightmares. The word itself derives from mare, a female spirit believed to cause bad dreams by sitting on sleepers' chests, were distinguished from ordinary bad dreams by their intensity and recurring nature. A person plagued by nightmares might seek help from someone in the community known for spiritual wisdom, perhaps an older woman who knew prayers and remedies passed down through generations. These wise women occupied ambiguous positions in frontier society, respected for their knowledge but sometimes viewed with suspicion, their power both sought and feared. They knew herbs and prayers, the borderlands between folk medicine and folk magic, operating in spaces that made more conventional religious authorities uncomfortable. The remedy might involve herbal preparations, chamomile or valerian tea before bed, to promote calm sleep through the plant's natural sedative properties that modern pharmacology has confirmed. It might involve ritual actions, turning your nightshirt inside out, walking backward to bed, or sleeping with a knife under the pillow to cut the nightmare's power symbolically. Mugwort was another herb associated with dreams, believed to enhance prophetic visions when placed under the pillow, its aromatic properties somehow opening channels to deeper perception. Lavender promoted peaceful sleep, its scent having genuine calming properties that modern science has confirmed, the folk wisdom validated by contemporary research. Modern understanding would see these as psychological interventions, rituals that provided a sense of control and thus reduced anxiety that might otherwise prevent restful sleep. But to frontier families, they were practical solutions to real spiritual problems as sensible as any other household management, the distinction between psychology and spirituality not yet carved into separate domains. The concept of two sleeps, or segmented sleep, was still common in this era, inherited from medieval European patterns that persisted into the modern age. People would sleep for several hours after dark, the first sleep, then wake naturally around midnight for an hour or two of quiet activity before returning to bed. During this wakeful period, they might stoke the fire, use the chamber pot, check on children or animals, pray, or simply lie in contemplation of the day past and the day coming. Some couples used this time for intimacy or quiet conversation, the middle of the night offering privacy that daylight hours rarely provided in crowded cabin spaces. Then came the second sleep, lasting until dawn broke, and work called them back to waking life. This bifurcated rest was considered normal, natural, the way humans were meant to sleep according to their God-given nature. The midnight waking was called by various names: the watching, the night wake, or simply first waking, each term reflecting different cultural traditions. It was a liminal time, neither day nor night, when the world felt especially still, and thoughts turned philosophical or spiritual, freed from the demands of active life. This pattern worked well with frontier life, serving multiple practical purposes beyond simply providing rest. The middle night waking provided a natural opportunity to tend the fire, ensuring it wouldn't die completely and leave the family to wake in dangerous cold. It also meant someone was semi-conscious during the most dangerous hours, when attacks or emergencies were most likely to occur, and quick response could mean survival. The segmented pattern served protective functions even as it felt natural and restful, another example of cultural practice aligning with practical need. As the 19th century progressed and artificial lighting became more common, this segmented sleep pattern gradually disappeared from Western culture, replaced by the continuous 8-hour sleep we now consider normal. But during the frontier era, it remained the norm, a rhythm of rest adapted to the realities of maintaining fire and watching for danger through long nights. The change came gradually, first in cities where gaslighting extended active hours and industrial labor demanded standardized schedules, then spreading to rural areas. The Industrial Revolution's demand for standardized work schedules eventually made continuous sleep, normative and segmented sleep seem disordered, pathologizing what had been natural for millennia. The spiritualization of sleep extended to death, the final sleep that all would eventually enter, the ultimate rest from earthly labor and suffering. Frontier families prepared for this eventuality with a pragmatism that seems startling now but was simply realistic given the mortality rates they experienced. Mothers sometimes kept a child's growing measurements marked on a doorframe, not just to celebrate growth, but to know what size coffin would be needed if the worst happened. This wasn't morbid, but practical. Coffins had to be built quickly before bodies deteriorated in heat, and knowing dimensions in advance saved precious time during crisis. The vocabulary around death borrowed heavily from sleep. Eternal rest. Slumber in the Lord. Sleep in Jesus, each phrase softening death's finality through familiar metaphor. This linguistic connection made death less frightening, a sleep from which one would eventually wake in a better place. The resurrection promise made concrete through everyday language. The metaphor extended deeply. The dead were laid to rest, their bodies sleeping until resurrection, never truly gone but simply absent temporarily. Graveyards were called sleeping grounds or resting places, never explicitly death yards, or similar harsh terms that would acknowledge the finality too baldly. Frontier graveyards, when you visit them today, often feature headstones with sleeping imagery, carved pillows, reclining figures, phrases like "gone to rest" or "peacefully sleeping" that blur the line between temporary and permanent absence. Death and sleep were conceptually linked, one temporary and nightly, the other permanent but not final, if one maintained faith in resurrection and eternal life. Some stones show hands reaching upward or downward, representing the connection between earthly sleep and heavenly waking, the gesture bridging two realms. Others feature broken columns, symbolizing life cut short, but still part of a divine structure, the architectural metaphor suggesting that what appears ruined serves a larger design. This connection influenced nighttime prayers and rituals in profound ways, making bedtime a rehearsal for death in miniature. The possibility of not waking was acknowledged but not feared, or rather, the fear was managed through faith and ritual preparation that turned anxiety into devotion. One went to sleep properly prepared spiritually, just in case this night proved to be the last, each bedtime potentially final. The bedtime prayer ensured that if death came during the night, the soul would be ready, properly oriented toward divine mercy rather than caught in sin. Children absorbed these attitudes, learning to see sleep as a kind of temporary death, and death as a permanent sleep, the two states existing on a continuum. This might seem psychologically troubling by modern standards, but it actually helped frontier children cope with the high mortality rates they witnessed regularly. By familiarizing children with death through the metaphor of sleep, parents made the inevitable less terrifying and more comprehensible to young minds. Death became not a monstrous ending, but a natural transition, as normal and non-threatening as closing one's eyes each night, simply a longer sleep than usual. The mystery of dreams received particular attention during times of crisis when the boundary between life and death seemed especially permeable. During epidemics, when death visited frequently, people reported vivid dreams of deceased relatives beckoning them forward or warning them back, depending on whether their time had come. These dreams were taken seriously, discussed openly, and sometimes influenced decisions about treatment or travel that could determine survival. A dream of a dead mother warning her daughter to leave a certain area might prompt a family to relocate, even if practical considerations suggested staying put. Communities shared dream reports during crises, comparing experiences and trying to discern patterns or warnings that might help the living avoid death's approach. If multiple people dreamed of flooding, the community might move to higher ground, even without physical evidence of danger, the collective dreaming outweighing empirical observation. Whether these dreams were psychological processing of grief and fear, or something more supernatural, was not a question frontier people asked or cared about. The dreams were real in their effects, and that reality mattered more than philosophical classification or academic debate about their ultimate source. The relationship between sleep and spiritual knowledge was considered direct and unmediated, sleep providing access that waking consciousness could not achieve. Prophets and seers throughout history received visions during sleep. Ordinary people might receive smaller revelations or guidance proportionate to their spiritual station. Biblical precedents supported this belief. Joseph's dreams predicting famine, Daniel's visions of future kingdoms, the angel visiting Mary to announce Christ's coming. Sleep was when divine communication happened most clearly, the waking mind's chatter finally quieted enough to hear the still small voice that spoke truth. Some frontier preachers claimed to have received entire sermons in dreams, waking to transcribe them before the words faded back into unconsciousness. Others reported dreams that resolved practical problems, where to dig for water, which path to take through dangerous territory, how to treat a sick child when no doctor was available. These dream solutions were sometimes remarkably practical, suggesting the unconscious mind's ability to work through problems that the waking mind found overwhelming or insoluble. But to frontier people, the source was less important than the result. If a dream provided useful guidance, it was accepted gratefully wherever it came from, divine or merely deeply human. The integration of Native American and European beliefs about sleep created a uniquely frontier spirituality, neither fully one nor the other, but something new, born of collision and necessity. A settler woman might say Christian prayers while arranging her children according to indigenous wisdom about sleeping positions and orientations, the blending occurring naturally at the level of daily practice. This syncretism was rarely acknowledged openly. Both cultures maintained public boundaries and claimed purity of tradition, each asserting its superiority over the other in public discourse. But in the private darkness of cabins, in the vulnerable hours of night, practical wisdom from any source was welcomed without the prejudice that governed daylight interactions. The blending created something new, a frontier culture of sleep that was distinctly American rather than transplanted European or purely indigenous. It preserved Old World traditions while adapting to New World realities, incorporating indigenous knowledge while maintaining European religious frameworks that provided cultural continuity and spiritual comfort. The archaeological and historical evidence of these beliefs comes to us in fragments, a charm here, a diary entry there, an oral history recorded decades later by descendants who only half remembered what their grandparents practiced. The full texture of frontier sleep culture is irretrievable, lost with the last person who lived it fully and understood its complete symbolic system. But the fragments paint a picture of people trying to make sense of vulnerability, using every tool available: prayer, ritual, borrowed wisdom, superstition, and practical experience. They inhabited a world where the night was genuinely dangerous, where sleep made one vulnerable, and where the boundary between physical and spiritual threat was unclear and perhaps meaningless. In this context, the elaborate rituals around sleep were not primitive superstition, but sophisticated coping mechanisms developed over generations and tested against harsh reality. They provided psychological protection that was as real and necessary as physical shelter, perhaps more so given that the mind's collapse could doom the body. The human need for control in uncontrollable circumstances drove these practices, channeling anxiety into productive action rather than paralyzing fear. By following proper procedures, people transformed chaos into order, random danger into manageable risk, feeling themselves active participants in their survival rather than passive victims of fate. Modern sleep happens in controlled environments, with locks and alarms and emergency services a phone call away, the vulnerability almost completely managed through technology and social infrastructure. Frontier sleep happened in fragile shelters, with no help within reach, in a world that felt saturated with both natural and supernatural danger pressing in from all sides. The contrast is profound. We sleep casually, often carelessly, taking safety for granted as our birthright and natural condition. They slept ritually, carefully, acknowledging danger while working to mitigate it through every means available, physical and spiritual combined. The rituals, beliefs, and practices that developed around frontier sleep were perfectly adapted to those conditions, each element serving multiple functions simultaneously. They helped people rest despite fear, sleep despite vigilance, and wake to face another day of survival with minds and spirits intact. The sophistication of these adaptive strategies deserves recognition rather than dismissal as quaint superstition or primitive thinking. These were not simple-minded people clinging to superstition, but intelligent humans creating functional responses to genuine threats using the conceptual tools their culture provided. The consistency of these practices across different frontier regions suggests they worked in some meaningful sense, whether through psychological comfort or actual efficacy. The fact that families passed them down across generations indicates their perceived value, each parent teaching children what had kept them alive through vulnerable nights. Perhaps in their sleepless nights, staring into darkness while listening for danger, frontier settlers felt what we occasionally feel, that the night is not just absence of light, but a presence of its own. That vast darkness seemed knowing and indifferent, containing forces beyond human comprehension that could only be managed, never truly controlled. That sleep is a kind of trust, a surrender to vulnerability, a faith that we will wake again despite yielding consciousness to the unknown. This existential awareness shapes the human relationship with sleep across all cultures and times, connecting us to ancestors we never knew. They ritualized this surrender, made it sacred, surrounded it with protective practices and beliefs that acknowledge the magnitude of what sleep required. And perhaps that wisdom is not entirely lost. Perhaps we too, in our modern beds with our modern anxieties, might benefit from treating sleep as something more than mere unconsciousness, something deserving of ritual and reverence and care, not just efficiency and productivity measured in hours logged and sleep cycles completed. The frontier approach to sleep recognized its sacred dimension, the nightly journey into mystery that every human must make. The modern sleep hygiene movement, with its emphasis on routine and environment, unknowingly echoes frontier wisdom in secular language. The recommendation for consistent bedtime rituals recognizes what frontier people knew, that the transition to sleep benefits from structure and intention rather than abrupt collapse into unconsciousness. The emphasis on dark, cool, quiet sleeping environments replicates conditions frontier families tried to create within their limited means and understanding. The recognition that anxiety and stress interfere with sleep acknowledges what bedtime prayers addressed, that the mind must be settled before the body can truly rest. Even modern sleep tracking technology, in its way, echoes the frontier practice of attending carefully to sleep patterns and dream content. The difference lies mainly in the framework. We speak of circadian rhythms and REM cycles, where they spoke of spiritual rhythms and prophetic dreams. But both systems attempt to understand and optimize the mysterious third of life we spend unconscious, vulnerable, and somehow renewed. Both recognize that sleep is not merely absence of waking, but a distinct state with its own logic and requirements. The objects we place near our beds today, family photographs, meaningful keepsakes, books that comfort us, serve functions similar to the protective items frontier families tucked into their mattresses. We may not articulate their purpose in spiritual terms, but we recognize their psychological importance, their ability to make sleep spaces feel safe and personal. Children's attachment to specific blankets or stuffed animals echoes the frontier practice of comfort objects imbued with protective power. We understand now that these attachments serve developmental purposes, helping children regulate emotion and anxiety, but the underlying human need they address remains constant across centuries. The nightlight in a child's room performs the same function as the small Betty lamp frontier families left burning, pushing back complete darkness enough to allow rest without wasting resources on full illumination. The compromise between economy and comfort, between adult practicality and childhood fear, remains fundamentally unchanged. Bedtime stories continue the tradition of fathers speaking into the darkness, creating islands of safety through narrative and familiar voice. The content has changed. We tell stories of friendly monsters and magical adventures rather than pioneering exploits, but the comfort provided remains identical. Lullabies persist across cultures and generations, their melodies often unchanged for centuries, connecting modern parents to ancestors who sang the same songs in vastly different circumstances. The human voice soothing children into sleep represents perhaps the most ancient and universal of all bedtime rituals. The fire fades, the walls creak, and once more the night begins its slow conversation with the living, a dialogue that has continued since humans first sought shelter from darkness. In frontier cabins long turned to dust, in memories preserved only in fragments, the dreamers lie down and trust the darkness to carry them through until dawn. Their struggles and solutions, their fears and faiths, their practical wisdom and spiritual practices form a legacy that persists in unexpected ways. In the prayers, some still recite before sleep. In the comfort objects children clutch in darkness. In the superstitions we half believe and half mock, while still practicing them just in case. The frontier is gone, but the human need for protection against the night remains, eternal as darkness itself and as fundamental to our nature. We have gained much in security and understanding since those days when every night was uncertain and every sleep a small act of faith. But we have also lost something, the conscious recognition of sleep's sacred dimension, the acknowledgement that surrendering to unconsciousness requires trust in forces beyond ourselves. Modern life encourages us to treat sleep as mere physical maintenance, downtime for the machine, hours that could be better used productively. Frontier families knew better, understood that sleep was spiritual as well as physical, that dreams carried meaning, that the night hours required respect and ritual. Their approach may have been superstitious by our standards, but it recognized a truth we have forgotten, that sleep is not simply absence but presence, that the darkness contains mysteries our waking minds cannot fathom, that dreams speak truths our conscious selves resist, that vulnerability can be sacred when properly honored. These insights persist at the margins of modern consciousness, surfacing in moments when our technological confidence falters. When we lie awake at 3 a.m. with nameless anxieties, or wake from dreams so vivid they seem more real than waking life, or feel the darkness as an almost physical presence pressing against our safe walls. In these moments, we touch briefly the frontier experience of night, understanding why rituals and protections felt not superstitious but necessary. The modern world has pushed darkness back with electric lights that turn night into extended day, creating an illusion of control that frontier families never enjoyed or claimed. We have mapped the genome and split the atom, conquered diseases that once decimated populations, built machines that think and communicate across vast distances. Yet we still close our eyes each night and surrender consciousness to processes we only partially understand, still dream in symbols whose meanings elude us, still wake sometimes with the inexplicable conviction that we have traveled somewhere beyond the merely physical. The mystery persists beneath our explanations, the sacred hidden within the mundane. Frontier sleep culture, for all its superstitions and limitations, recognized this mystery and honored it through ritual and belief, creating structures that allowed people to rest despite danger. Their legacy invites us to reconsider our own relationship with sleep, to recognize that treating it merely as biological necessity impoverishes our understanding. Perhaps we might recover some of their wisdom, not the specific superstitions, but the underlying reverence for sleep's importance, the recognition that how we approach rest matters as much as how much rest we get, that bedtime rituals serve purposes beyond efficiency, that the transition from waking to sleeping deserves attention and care, that in surrendering to sleep we participate in something larger than ourselves, a nightly dying and rebirth that connects us to all humans across history who have faced the darkness and trusted dawn would come. The frontier families who developed elaborate sleep rituals understood this implicitly, built their practices on this foundation. Their cabins have dissolved back into the earth from which they were raised, their bodies long returned to dust, their names mostly forgotten except on weathered stones in neglected cemeteries, but their wisdom about sleep, preserved in fragments and echoes, in archaeological traces and oral histories, in practices we maintain without remembering their origin, continues to speak. It whispers that sleep deserves respect, that darkness holds both danger and renewal, that surrender requires courage, that vulnerability can be strength when properly honored. It suggests that the boundary between waking and sleeping, between physical and spiritual, between life and death, remains permeable despite our efforts to draw firm lines. And it reminds us that we are not so different from those frontier settlers who lay down in darkness centuries ago, trusting forces they could not control to carry them through to morning. We use different words, claim different knowledge, surround ourselves with different protections, but we face the same essential mystery. Each night we close our eyes and let go of control, surrendering to sleep with faith that consciousness will return, that we will wake ourselves and not someone else, that the strange countries we visit in dreams will release us back to waking life. This act of trust, performed billions of times nightly across the globe, remains as profound as any religious ritual. The frontier is gone, vanished into history, along with the specific dangers that haunted those early settlements and shaped their nighttime practices. But the night remains and sleep remains, and the human need to make meaning of vulnerability remains constant through all our changes. In this continuity lies connection to those who came before, whose rituals seem strange, but whose fears and hopes we recognize as our own beneath unfamiliar forms. They were us, sleeping in harder circumstances, but facing the same essential questions about trust and safety, consciousness and mystery, life and death. Their answer was ritual, was prayer, was careful attention to signs and symbols, was the building of structures, physical and spiritual, that allowed rest despite danger. Our answer uses different language but serves the same need, the universal human requirement to find safety enough to surrender control. The darkness deepens, the fire fades to embers, and another night begins its ancient work of mystery and renewal, as it has since humans first became conscious enough to fear what sleep might bring. In honoring the frontier approach to sleep, we honor our ancestors and recognize ourselves vulnerable, hopeful, afraid, faithful, human in the most fundamental sense, still seeking safety in the darkness, still creating rituals to manage fear, still lying down each night with faith that morning will come and find us whole. The frontier taught hard lessons about survival, but perhaps none more important than this, that acknowledging vulnerability is not weakness but wisdom, and that surrender, properly prepared for and entered into with intention, can be the most courageous act of all. Not all who lived on the frontier experienced the harsh conditions we've explored thus far. Even in the wilderness, hierarchies persisted, and some enjoyed comforts that would have seemed impossible luxuries to families sleeping on straw ticks in drafty cabins. Let us shift our attention now to a different kind of frontier dwelling, the homes of military officers, government officials, successful merchants, and landed gentry who established themselves in newly settled territories. Their nights were fundamentally different, marked by a warmth both literal and symbolic that separated them from their struggling neighbors. Consider a garrison commander's quarters at a frontier fort in the 1790s. While soldiers slept in crowded barracks and nearby settlers huddled in log cabins, the commander occupied a proper house, not grand by Eastern standards, but remarkably refined for the wilderness. The structure itself announced status. Built of sawn lumber rather than rough logs, with glass windows instead of oiled paper, the house had multiple rooms with distinct purposes: a parlour for receiving visitors, a separate dining room, actual bedrooms with doors that closed. The bedroom, where the commander and his wife slept, bore little resemblance to settler accommodations. A proper wooden bed frame, raised high off the floor, supported a feather mattress imported from the East at considerable expense. Feathers required enormous quantities of geese or ducks, careful cleaning and drying, and expert sewing of the tick to prevent feathers from escaping. The resulting mattress was impossibly soft compared to straw, conforming to the body rather than resisting it. Layers of linens covered the mattress, sheets of cotton or linen, changed regularly, washed and sun-bleached to maintain whiteness. Such attention to bedding hygiene was possible only with servants to manage the labor-intensive washing process. Blankets were wool, professionally woven, supplemented by quilts made from quality fabric rather than scraps. During the coldest months, additional bedding could be added, more blankets, more quilts, as many layers as comfort required. The ultimate luxury was a warming pan, a covered metal pan with a long handle filled with hot coals from the fire and run between the sheets just before bed. This simple device transformed sleep, turning cold linens into a warm nest that retained heat for hours. The warming pan ritual became part of the nightly routine performed by servants in wealthier homes. The mistress might supervise, ensuring the coals were hot enough, but not so hot as to scorch fabric, that every section of the bed received attention. By the time the commander and his wife entered the bedroom, the space had been prepared for comfort. The fire in the bedroom hearth burned steadily, professionally built by someone who understood the science of combustion and had time to do it properly. Unlike frontier families who had to choose between wasting wood and freezing, elite households maintained fires in multiple rooms simultaneously. Wood was still labor, but that labor was performed by others, servants, slaves, or hired men whose full-time job was cutting and hauling fuel. The psychological difference this made cannot be overstated. To know that warmth would continue through the night, that you would not wake shivering, that someone else would tend the fire, this removed a layer of anxiety that poor settlers never escaped. The bedroom itself was decorated in ways that announced civilization's persistence despite the wilderness setting. Walls might be panelled or plastered and papered with patterns imported from England or France. Furniture beyond the bed included a chest of drawers for clothing, a washstand with basin and pitcher, perhaps a small writing desk. These items served practical purposes but also displayed wealth. Each represented significant cost in materials and transport. Candlesticks held proper wax candles, not tallow that smoked and smelled. Multiple candles might burn at once, creating light sufficient for reading before bed, a luxury inconceivable to families rationing every hour of expensive illumination. The commander's wife might read from a novel or poetry, a leisure activity possible only when basic survival wasn't consuming every moment. Her husband might review correspondence or reports, work that could wait until he was comfortable and unhurried. Their night clothes differed dramatically from the frontier norm. Instead of sleeping in day clothes for warmth, they changed into garments specifically designed for bed. A linen nightshirt for him, a long nightgown for her. These garments were regularly washed, kept separate from day clothing, part of an elaborate ritual of cleanliness that was itself a marker of class. Poor families couldn't afford extra clothing or the time and resources for frequent washing. The act of changing clothes became part of the transition to sleep, a ritual marking the boundary between day and night. Servants might assist with undressing, particularly with the complicated fastenings of women's garments. Privacy was perhaps the greatest luxury. The bedroom door could close, creating a space separate from servants and children. The couple could speak freely, be intimate without being overheard, sleep without the constant presence of others. Children of elite families slept in separate rooms or in nurseries attended by servants, were freed from the constant vigilance that marked frontier family sleep, from the need to listen for children's breathing, to comfort them through nightmares, to share warmth out of necessity. This separation of family members by function and age was a hallmark of elite domestic life, impossible for poor families in single-room cabins. Space itself became a luxury commodity, purchased through wealth and maintained through servants' labor. The nighttime soundscape differed as well. Elite homes were built solidly enough to muffle wind and rain, thick enough to keep out the constant creaking and groaning of log construction. What sounds did penetrate were often deliberately cultivated, a clock ticking on the mantel, marking time with mechanical precision. The clock itself was valuable, but more than that, it represented control over time, the ability to measure and segment life with exactitude. Frontier families lived by sun and season, their nights unmarked by any timepiece. Elite families divided night itself into measured hours, their sleep scheduled rather than determined purely by darkness and exhaustion. The morning routine revealed even more disparities. While frontier families woke to cold cabins requiring immediate fire building, elite households woke to rooms already warmed by fires lit earlier by servants. Hot water appeared for washing, breakfast was prepared by others, clothing was laid out or even helped into. The burden of survival was diffused across multiple people, freeing the elite to focus on administration, business, or leisure. But we should not imagine elite sleep was entirely peaceful. The responsibilities of command, commerce, or governance brought their own anxieties that interrupted rest. The garrison commander worried about supply lines, about the loyalty of his men, about potential attacks he was responsible for preventing. These concerns could manifest as insomnia, restless nights, despite physical comfort. His wife worried about maintaining social position in this remote setting, about managing servants, about the health of children in a place where doctors were scarce even for the wealthy. Comfort did not eliminate anxiety, it merely changed its nature. Merchants who established trading posts in frontier regions accumulated wealth through the labor and custom of poorer settlers. They slept well-fed and warm while knowing their prosperity depended on the desperation of others willing to pay inflated prices for necessities. Some carried this knowledge untroubled, viewing wealth disparity as natural order. Others experienced guilt that disrupted their rest, creating a different kind of sleeplessness than physical discomfort. Government officials appointed to frontier posts often came from eastern cities, their expectations shaped by more refined environments. The frontier, even experienced from positions of relative privilege, could feel like exile. They might sleep in the best bed available for hundreds of miles, yet still feel displaced, uncomfortable in ways that physical luxury couldn't address. Cultural isolation created its own form of suffering, milder than poverty, but real nonetheless. The social rituals around sleep also differed dramatically by class. Elite families maintained elaborate bedtime routines imported from European aristocratic practices, saying formal goodnights, kissing hands, performing small ceremonies of affection and hierarchy. Servants were dismissed with specific instructions for mourning, creating the fiction that the household ran itself. The labor that made comfort possible was rendered invisible through careful social choreography. Guest rooms in elite homes were prepared with the same attention to comfort, offering visitors a haven from frontier roughness. The ability to provide such hospitality was itself a display of wealth and power. In contrast, frontier families who hosted travelers offered whatever could be spared: a space on the floor near the fire, a share of their meager blankets. Hospitality was generous but could not transcend material limitations. The quality of sleep itself differed between classes. Elite families could surrender fully to rest, protected by servants who maintained watches, by solid walls that genuinely held back the elements, by economic security that removed existential fear. Their dreams might be troubled by social or professional anxieties, but not by the immediate physical threats that haunted frontier families' sleep. They did not dream of wolves at the door, because walls and distance and hired protection stood between them and such dangers. The morning after a comfortable sleep meant waking restored, able to think clearly and act decisively. This differential in rest quality translated directly to differential in capability and power. A well-rested commander made better decisions than exhausted soldiers. A well-rested merchant negotiated more effectively than desperate settlers. Sleep itself became a tool of power, its quality correlating directly with social position. Yet even among the elite, the frontier imposed limitations unknown in established cities. The finest frontier home was still crude by Eastern standards, still isolated from culture and sophisticated society. Letters took weeks or months to arrive. Books and newspapers were outdated by the time they reached the wilderness. Entertainment was limited to what could be created locally or imported at great expense. So elite frontier sleep happened in a paradoxical space, comfortable relative to poor settlers, yet still characterized by isolation and rustic conditions compared to true urban wealth. They were the wealthiest people in a poor place, their privilege both real and constrained. The symbolism of warmth extended beyond physical temperature. To be warm was to be civilized, to have pushed back chaos and wilderness, to have created a bubble of order in surrounding disorder. Elite families, quite literally, glowed with warmth, their heated homes visible from outside as lit windows in the darkness, announcing human presence and human dominion. Poor families' cabins barely interrupted the darkness, their dim fires insufficient to create much outward glow. This visual difference reinforced social hierarchy. Anyone traveling at night could see who possessed warmth and light, who commanded resources sufficient to push back the darkness more effectively. Inside those warm, lit homes, bedtime prayers took on different character. Elite families thanked God for their blessings with an awareness, suppressed or acknowledged, that those blessings were not universally distributed. Some wrestled with theological questions about why God granted comfort to some and suffering to others. Others simply accepted it as divine order, their privilege reflecting God's favor and therefore requiring no justification. The children of elite families learned from birth that comfort was normal, that warmth and adequate food and privacy were simply how life worked. They grew into adults expecting these conditions, struggling to understand or empathize with those who lacked them. In contrast, frontier children who survived to adulthood carried permanent memories of cold and hunger and fear. Even if they later achieved some prosperity, they never fully shed the psychological marks of early deprivation. These different childhood experiences created profoundly different adults with different capacities for empathy, different expectations about life, different relationships with comfort and suffering. Sleep, or the quality of sleep, literally shaped human development. The frontier elite sometimes hosted poorer neighbors for social occasions, creating moments where the disparity became visible to both parties. A settler woman invited to tea in a proper parlour, who would later return to her drafty cabin, experienced the contrast viscerally. Some elite women performed charity, offering cast-off clothing or food to struggling families. These gestures were genuinely helpful, but also reinforced hierarchy, the giver and receiver roles clear and fixed. The psychological complexity of accepting such charity while maintaining dignity created its own burden. Frontier families had to balance pride against need, had to accept help without accepting inferiority. At night, in their respective beds, one feathered and warm, the other straw and cold, both giver and receiver might think about these encounters. The elite woman might feel virtuous or troubled, the poor woman might feel grateful or resentful, or some complicated mixture of both. The economic structures of frontier settlement ensured that wealth concentrated upward. The merchant sold goods at markup, the landowner charged rent, the mill owner took a portion of grain for grinding. Each transaction was individually fair by the market logic of the time, but cumulatively they ensured that those who started with capital ended with more, while those who started with only labor stayed poor. This pattern replicated itself endlessly across the frontier. Sleep became a marker of these economic realities. The well-rested negotiated from positions of strength, the exhausted accepted unfavorable terms out of desperation. A settler who'd been up all night with sick children, who desperately needed seed for planting, who had no other options. Such a person could not bargain effectively with a well-rested merchant offering credit at punishing interest rates. The resulting debt might take generations to escape. Thus, sleep, or its absence, became woven into the creation of lasting economic inequality. The frontier, mythologized as a place of opportunity where anyone could succeed through hard work, actually replicated and often intensified the class structures of older settlements. The comfortable sleep of the elite depended on systems that ensured poor settlers would sleep poorly. This was not conspiracy but structural. The same economic relationships that generated wealth for some generated poverty for others. Some elite individuals recognized and were troubled by this reality. Their letters and diaries reveal moral wrestling, awareness that their comfort came at others' expense, uncertainty about the justice of the social order they benefited from. Others developed elaborate justifications. The poor were lazy, improvident, morally inferior, and therefore deserved their poverty. Such reasoning allowed comfortable sleep untroubled by guilt, the conscience quieted through ideology. The truth, of course, was more complex. Some frontier families did rise from poverty to prosperity through luck, skill, and relentless effort, but far more remained poor or descended into deeper poverty despite working themselves to exhaustion. The mythology of frontier opportunity was not entirely false, but it was selective. It celebrated exceptional cases while ignoring typical ones. Most settlers lived and died in conditions not far removed from the hardship they'd hoped to escape. As night fell across the frontier, the difference in how people prepared for sleep enacted these inequalities in miniature. The elite ritual of comfort, the poor ritual of endurance, Both were nightly performances of their social positions, and the wind, impartial and eternal, moved between them both. It found the gaps in the poor cabin just as it found the few gaps in the elite home, though in very different proportions. It carried the smoke from inadequate fires and from abundant ones, mixing them in the dark sky above. It witnessed all sleepers, comfortable and struggling, powerful and powerless, without judgment or preference. Perhaps in this impartiality of natural forces we find something worth contemplating. The wind, the cold, the turning of night to day. These things acted on all equally, regardless of human hierarchies. The elite could purchase more effective protection against these forces, but they could not escape them entirely. The cold still existed beyond their walls. The wilderness still pressed close despite their lights. And in sleep, all humans shared a fundamental vulnerability. The wealthiest merchant in deepest sleep was as helpless as the poorest settler, both surrendered to unconsciousness, both dependent on others or luck for protection. This equality in vulnerability perhaps explains why sleep was so ritualized across all classes. It was the nightly reminder that despite all human efforts to create security, we remain fragile creatures in a vast and indifferent universe. Warmth was the great divider, not wealth itself, but the simple luxury of sleeping without fear, the simple mercy of sleeping warm. Somewhere in the wilderness, a family shivers by a dying fire, counting hours until dawn. Somewhere else, behind brick and candlelight, another sleeps in perfect warmth, dreaming dreams untroubled by immediate physical distress. And between these extremes, gradations of comfort and discomfort, warmth and cold, rest and restlessness play out across the frontier night. The distance between them is measured in miles, but also in vastly different experiences of what it means to be human, to need rest, to seek safety in the vulnerable hours of darkness. As we drift away from these elite bedrooms and return our attention to the broader patterns of frontier sleep, we carry an awareness of disparity. Comfort was possible even in the wilderness, but only for the few, only through systems that ensured others would continue to struggle. The contrast is not meant to inspire resentment, but understanding that human suffering and comfort have always existed side by side, that the conditions of our rest reflect and reinforce larger social patterns, and that the simple act of lying down to sleep has never been as simple or equal as we might imagine. We have drifted together through the long frontier night, from the cold cabins of ordinary settlers, through Rebecca Boone's resilient endurance, past the mysterious rituals that made sleep sacred, and finally into the warm bedrooms of the privileged few. Each segment has revealed something essential about how our ancestors negotiated that most vulnerable of human necessities, rest. The settlers we've accompanied tonight lived lives of remarkable hardship, their sleep a nightly challenge rather than a given comfort. They lay on straw ticks in drafty cabins, shared warmth with their children out of necessity, and woke repeatedly through the darkness to tend fires that meant survival. Yet within this hardship they created meaning. Their rituals around sleep, the prayers and protective charms, the careful banking of fires, the arrangements of bodies and blankets, transformed a biological necessity into something almost sacred. They borrowed wisdom from their native neighbors, adapted European traditions to new circumstances, and developed practices uniquely suited to frontier conditions. In doing so, they demonstrated human resilience and creativity in the face of environments that offered little mercy. Rebecca Boone stands as representative of countless women who endured these conditions year after year, bearing and raising children in circumstances that would break less determined spirits. Her story reminds us that frontier settlement was not only masculine adventure but feminine perseverance, not only exploration, but domestic survival. The mysteries and beliefs surrounding sleep reveal how our ancestors understood vulnerability. They did not yet know about REM cycles or circadian rhythms, but they knew that sleep was when the soul grew close to something beyond the everyday, when dreams could carry messages, when protection was most needed. And the disparity between how the elite and the poor experienced frontier nights teaches us that comfort has always been unequally distributed, that warmth itself can be a form of power, and that the quality of our rest reflects larger social realities we often prefer to ignore. But here, at the end of our journey, let us not focus on these injustices, but on something more fundamental, the shared human need for rest that connects settler to merchant, Rebecca Boone to garrison commander, parent to child across the centuries. All slept, all dreamed, all woke again to face another day, and in that basic rhythm they were equal even when nothing else was equal. Consider how far we've come from those frozen nights. You lie now in comfort unimaginable to frontier families. Temperature controlled precisely. Mattresses engineered for support. Blankets chosen for aesthetics as much as warmth. You do not worry about fires dying in the night, about wolves approaching your walls, about waking to frozen water buckets, and the enormous labor of simply making it through another day. These victories are recent in human history. These comforts, taken for granted by those fortunate enough to have been born into modernity. Yet, perhaps we can learn something from those who slept so much less comfortably than we do. They understood that rest is precious precisely because it is vulnerable, that sleep requires trust in the world's basic mercy, that the surrender to unconsciousness is a nightly act of faith. They ritualized this faith, surrounded it with practices and beliefs that acknowledged both the danger and the necessity of sleep. And perhaps we, in our comfortable beds, might benefit from treating our own rest with similar reverence. As you drift towards sleep tonight, if you are listening to these words in that drowsy state between waking and dreaming, let yourself feel gratitude for the simple miracle of warmth, for the walls that hold back cold and wind, for the softness beneath you, for the safety that allows you to truly rest. And perhaps spare a thought for those who came before, who slept so much less easily, whose nights were marked by cold and vigilance and the constant negotiation with hardship. They endured so we might rest comfortably, their struggles purchased in some small way our ease. The frontier cabin has long since returned to earth, its logs rotted, its chinking scattered, its stones reclaimed by forest and field. The families who slept there have joined the vast community of ancestors, their specific dreams and fears and midnight wakings lost to time. But something remains in the stories passed down, in the archaeological fragments, in the very fact that we still think about how they lived and what they endured. They persist in memory, these sleepless settlers, these resilient pioneers, these ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply to survive. Let their example gentle you toward rest. Let the knowledge of their hardship help you appreciate your comfort. Let the rhythm of their nights, the banking of fires, the gathering of children, the prayers whispered into darkness, become a lullaby that carries you into peaceful sleep. The wind still blows across the places where they struggled, though no cabins remain to creak and groan beneath its touch. The stars still turn in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human striving below. And sleep still comes, as it always has, as a temporary cessation of our worries and labors, a nightly return to something like peace. May your own sleep tonight be gentle, deep, and undisturbed. May you wake refreshed, grateful for rest taken in warmth and safety. And may you carry forward, in some small way, the determination and endurance of those who slept so much less easily, but who survived night after difficult night through pure persistence and love. Rest now as the fire dims to embers, as the night deepens around you, as the long conversation between darkness and sleep begins once more. You are safe, you are warm, and you are connected across time To all those who have surrendered to sleep's embrace and trusted they would wake again to face another day. The cabin breathes its last around you. The story ends, and the most natural thing in the world, the gentle fall into sleep's mercy, welcomes you home. Rest well, traveller, through history's quiet corners. Rest well.